Don't open that hatch. One breath out there will kill you. The warning cracked across the shuttle just as the landing clamps locked into place with a heavy metallic thud. Every pair of eyes turned toward the reinforced airlock. Beyond it waited Vesper 9, a world every navigation chart in known space marked with the same blood-red classification, atmospheric death zone. Ryan Mercer remained strapped into his seat for another second, listening to the chorus of alarms echoing through the cabin. Flashing amber lights painted anxious faces across the alien survey crew as automated systems repeated the same message over and over. External atmosphere incompatible with all registered coalition species. Hazard level critical. Dr. Selvek, the expedition's chief xenobiologist, hurried down the narrow aisle clutching a breathing mask against his chest. His forefingers trembled just enough for Ryan to notice. Listen to me carefully, Selvek said, stopping in front of him. If your suit is damaged, do not remove your helmet. Not for 1 second. We have calculated less than 3 seconds before irreversible respiratory failure. Ryan managed a small nod. Got it. No, human. I do not think you do. Selvek lowered his voice. Nothing intelligent should be able to survive breathing this atmosphere. Ryan looked past him through the small observation window. Outside stretched a rocky valley beneath pale blue clouds drifting lazily across a copper-colored sky. It looked strangely peaceful. No boiling lakes. No rivers of acid. Just wind carrying dust over ancient cliffs. Honestly, Ryan muttered, I've seen worse weather driving through western Kansas. A few members of the crew glanced toward him, uncertain whether he was joking. Nobody laughed. The shuttle commander activated the external scanners again, as if hoping the instruments would suddenly admit they had been wrong all along. They were not. Oxygen levels fluctuated unpredictably. Sulfur compounds lingered near the surface. Reactive gases spiked without warning. Every simulation ended exactly the same way. Fatal exposure. Mission protocol has changed, Commander the Rex announced. Remote drones will perform all surface analysis. No biological personnel will exit. Ryan frowned. Then why am I here? Silence settled over the cabin. Finally, the commander answered without meeting his eyes. Because Earth insisted on sending a planetary systems engineer. Ryan leaned back and folded his arms. That tracked. 6 months earlier, someone in Washington had offered him a contract with almost no details, excellent pay, and enough non-disclosure paperwork to fill a garage. He had assumed he would be fixing mining equipment somewhere boring. Instead, he had spent 3 weeks crossing half the galaxy only to watch the smartest scientists in the coalition panic over fresh air. Selvek looked toward the sealed hatch again. Our ancestors believed worlds like this were cursed, he whispered. Entire civilizations disappeared attempting to study them. Ryan watched another gust of reddish dust sweep across the rocky plain. Something about the landscape felt familiar. Wild. Untamed. Honest. The same feeling he remembered standing on a mountain trail in Colorado before sunrise. Dangerous, maybe. Beautiful anyway. The shuttle vibrated as hydraulic locks disengaged. A mechanical voice announced, "Exterior access authorized." Every alien instinctively stepped backward. Ryan found himself stepping forward instead. "Mr. Mercer," Commander the Rex called sharply. "Remain exactly where you are." Ryan stopped beside the massive hatch and rested one hand against the cold metal. He could hear the wind outside now, low and steady, almost like distant ocean waves. He smiled to himself without really knowing why. "So," he said quietly, keeping his eyes on the sealed door, "this is the place." Commander the Rex slowly lowered his hand from the emergency override panel, but nobody moved. The entire cabin remained frozen, every member of the survey team staring at Ryan, as though he had casually volunteered to jump into a volcano. Dr. Selvek broke the silence first. "Human Mercer, I am issuing a direct medical order. You are not to approach that hatch any further." Ryan looked back over his shoulder. "I am standing 6 feet away from it. That is already too close." Ryan let out a quiet breath and smiled politely. "Back home we have warning labels that say things like that, usually right before somebody ignores them." A few confused faces turned toward one another, unsure whether he was making a joke or confessing a cultural flaw. Selvek sighed through his respirator. "You misunderstand the scale of the danger. Vesper 9 is not merely unpleasant. Every scientific expedition sent here has failed before meaningful field research could begin. Atmospheric chemistry shifts every few minutes. Entire ecosystems developed around compounds that most intelligent species classify as biological poisons. Ryan rested both hands in his jacket pockets and looked through the observation window again. The wind continued rolling across the stone ridges outside, carrying tiny spirals of red dust into the pale blue sky. There was something strangely familiar about it. It reminded him of photographs his grandfather had taken during road trips through the deserts of Arizona decades earlier. Dry, quiet, lonely. Looks peaceful, Ryan said. Commander the Rex answered immediately. That appearance has deceived civilizations for over 1,000 years. He activated the central display. A hologram filled the cabin, projecting the atmospheric profile in bright crimson layers. Oxygen concentration fluctuated unpredictably. Sulfur compounds drifted close to the ground. Reactive nitrogen pockets formed without warning. Unknown airborne microorganisms remained impossible to classify because every sample retrieval drone eventually malfunctioned after prolonged exposure. This world rejects visitors, the Rex explained. Every attempt to establish permanent research stations ended in equipment failure. Even autonomous machines become unreliable after several weeks. Ryan studied the chart carefully. Numbers had always made more sense to him than dramatic speeches. He noticed temperature swings that looked surprisingly manageable. Air pressure sat well within the range of several mountain regions on Earth. Gravity measured almost 0.95 g. Interesting, he murmured. Selvek looked puzzled. Interesting. Ryan pointed toward one section of the display. Your report spends 20 pages talking about chemical toxicity, but only one paragraph discusses weather patterns. Weather is irrelevant. Not where I come from. Ryan folded his arms. Sometimes the weather is what actually tries to kill you. Nobody answered. The aliens exchanged uncertain glances. One younger technician finally raised a hand. Human Mercer, was your homeworld truly classified as a habitable garden planet before your first contact? Ryan blinked. Who told you that? The educational database. Ryan laughed softly. Well, whoever wrote that has never spent a winter in Minnesota, a summer in Arizona, or tornado season in Oklahoma. Several members of the crew quietly entered notes into their tablets. Ryan noticed they were treating every casual sentence as valuable scientific testimony. That realization made him unexpectedly uneasy. He had not come here to represent all of humanity. He fixed machines. He filled out maintenance reports. He complained about airport coffee. Yet somehow he had become the only person aboard who viewed the planet outside as something other than certain death. Another gust rattled the shuttle against its landing struts. The sound echoed through the hull like distant thunder. Ryan stared through the glass one more time. The horizon stretched for miles beneath clear skies, untouched by cities, roads, or satellites. Whatever waited out there had frightened the galaxy for centuries. For reasons he could not explain, it did not frighten him nearly as much as everyone expected. The silence inside the shuttle grew heavier with every passing second until a sharp electronic tone broke it. The outer hatch had completed its pressure cycle. A green indicator illuminated above the massive door. Nobody moved. Commander the Rex swallowed hard before speaking. Seal remains intact. Environmental readings unchanged. Dr. Selvek looked from the display to Ryan and back again. Good. Then we continue with drone deployment. Ryan tilted his head. You came all the way across the galaxy to let a machine look outside. Selvek answered without humor. Machines are replaceable. Ryan understood exactly what he meant. He walked toward the observation window one last time. The valley beyond remained perfectly still. Thin clouds drifted overhead, and sunlight reflected across weathered stone formations that looked as though they had stood untouched for millions of years. It was beautiful in a quiet sort of way, the kind of place hikers back home would spend weeks trying to photograph. The commander activated the first survey drone. Through the external cameras, everyone watched the small six-legged machine step cautiously onto the rocky surface. It advanced only 30 feet before freezing in place. Warning symbols filled the screen. Internal sensors began reporting conflicting atmospheric data every few seconds. Again, the Rex ordered. A second drone rolled down the loading ramp. This one lasted almost 2 minutes before its navigation system started drifting in circles despite clear terrain. Ryan frowned. That is strange. This planet corrupts electronics, Selvek replied. Every expedition has documented the same phenomenon. Ryan kept watching. Something did not add up. The machines were not breaking. They looked confused, almost as if every sensor was arguing with every other sensor. Back in college, Ryan had spent countless nights troubleshooting industrial equipment that insisted something impossible was happening. Usually the equipment was not lying. It was simply measuring conditions engineers had never anticipated. Can I ask a dumb question? Ryan said. Selvek looked exhausted. At this point, Human Mercer, I welcome any question. Has anyone actually breathed the air? The cabin erupted with stunned expressions. One technician nearly dropped his tablet. Commander the Rex stared at Ryan as though he had suggested drinking lava. Absolutely not. Why not? Because every model predicts immediate biological failure. Ryan nodded slowly. Predictions are useful. He paused for a moment before adding. But they are still predictions. Dr. Selvek stepped closer until they stood only a few feet apart. You continue speaking as though uncertainty exists. Does it not? Ryan asked calmly. Selvek hesitated. Scientists rarely liked admitting uncertainty, yet Ryan could see it in his eyes. Every conclusion aboard this shuttle came from simulations, chemical analysis, and mathematical certainty. Nobody had ever simply experienced the environment firsthand. The realization settled over Ryan with surprising clarity. The entire galaxy feared this world because every instrument insisted they should. Nobody had stopped long enough to ask whether those instruments had been calibrated around species very different from humans. Ryan looked back toward the sealed hatch. Memories surfaced without warning. Hiking through the Rocky Mountains with his father at 16. The first breath of thin alpine air burning his lungs before his body adjusted. Working maintenance during chemical plant inspections where every strange smell triggered alarms until experienced crews confirmed the environment was stable. Humans had a habit of adapting first and worrying later. Sometimes that habit got people into trouble. Sometimes it revealed something everyone else had missed. Ryan reached toward the release handle. Instantly alarms screamed through the shuttle again. Human Mercer, Selvek shouted. Do not touch that door. Ryan rested his fingers against the cold steel without moving the mechanism. He looked back with the same calm expression he had worn since landing. I am not trying to prove anyone wrong, he said quietly. I just think there is only one way we are ever going to find out who is right. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The warning alarms continued pulsing through the shuttle until Commander the Rex finally silenced them with one firm tap against the control panel. The sudden quiet somehow felt even louder. Ryan slowly removed his hand from the release handle. He was not trying to force anyone into a decision. He simply wanted them to think beyond the numbers glowing on their screens. Dr. Selvek rubbed one hand across his forehead before looking toward the commander. We cannot proceed with the mission if our only surface data comes from malfunctioning equipment. The Rex nodded reluctantly. Agreed. One of the younger technicians cleared her throat. Then, what do we do? Nobody answered. Ryan leaned against the bulkhead with his arms folded. Run another comparison. Selvek frowned. Comparison with what? With Earth. Several heads turned toward him. Ryan continued. You keep describing this atmosphere as impossible because it falls outside the biological limits of coalition species. But humans are not coalition species. We evolved somewhere else. The doctor immediately pulled up Earth's environmental database. A series of charts floated above the central console. Ryan walked over and pointed at the display. Average oxygen levels. Seasonal variation. Natural sulfur emissions. Volcanic regions. High-altitude pressure changes. Industrial pollutants. The technician stared at the overlapping graphs in disbelief. Some of these values. Ryan nodded. Look familiar. She enlarged another section of the data. The cabin became so quiet Ryan could hear the ventilation fans humming overhead. Vesper 9 still ranked as a dangerous environment by every coalition standard, but several chemical patterns unexpectedly overlapped with conditions that naturally existed somewhere on Earth. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to make the comparison impossible to ignore. Selvek whispered almost to himself. Our predictive models were built using coalition biology as the universal baseline. Ryan gave a small shrug. That works until you meet somebody who did not evolve under the same rules. The doctor looked at him differently now. Not with confidence. Not even with curiosity. More like someone realizing an entire chapter of science might have been written with missing pages. Human Mercer, he asked quietly, would you honestly consider breathing unfamiliar air on your own planet? Ryan laughed under his breath. Not on purpose. But growing up, I breathed wildfire smoke, mountain air, city smog, humid summers, freezing winters, and enough dust during Little League Baseball to build character. Humans complain about the weather every day, then we go right back outside. A few members of the crew exchanged confused expressions. One technician whispered, you voluntarily remain outdoors during environmental discomfort? Ryan smiled. Most weekends. The answer produced another uncomfortable silence. Commander the Rex stepped toward the main viewport again. Beyond the glass, the valley remained unchanged, almost inviting. No violent storms. No clouds of corrosive gas. Just wind brushing across empty stone. Everything we know says this world is lethal, he said quietly. And yet everything we are observing today refuses to behave the way it should. Ryan looked out at the same horizon. His heartbeat had picked up, although he kept his expression calm. He was not fearless. He understood risk better than most people because he worked around heavy machinery his entire adult life. Confidence was never the absence of fear. It was making peace with uncertainty before taking the next step. He drew one slow breath and met the commander's eyes. Then maybe, he said, it is time we stopped asking whether this planet can support life and started asking a different question. What if it has been waiting for the wrong species to show up? Commander the Rex did not answer right away. He simply stood there, watching the empty valley through the reinforced viewport, as if expecting the planet itself to settle the argument. Finally, he turned toward the operations console. Open every historical survey we have on this world. I want the original reports, not the summaries. The technicians exchanged surprised looks before rushing to comply. Hundreds of expedition logs filled the main display. Ryan walked closer, quietly reading through decades of failed missions. The stories were remarkably similar. Atmospheric toxicity, equipment failure, retreat, recommendation against future exploration. What caught his attention was not what the reports included. It was what they left out. Nobody ever stayed longer than 6 hours, Ryan observed. Selvek looked over the same records. Longer exposure was considered irresponsible, so nobody ever gave themselves a chance to adapt. The doctor frowned. Adapt? Ryan nodded. Your body is not a machine. Sometimes it needs time. He thought back to his first construction job after college. Working outdoors during a brutal July heat wave had felt impossible during the first few days. By the second week, his body had adjusted. His grandfather used to say that people were tougher than they believed, as long as they respected the environment instead of fighting it. Ryan had never considered that lesson especially profound until now. One of the technicians interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Selvek, I found something unusual. She enlarged an old atmospheric scan recorded almost 180 years earlier. Chemical composition has remained almost perfectly stable. The fluctuations everyone feared are actually repeating in predictable cycles. Ryan leaned forward. Like weather. Exactly, the technician replied. We interpreted them as random because no coalition species could remain outside long enough to recognize the pattern. Selvek slowly lowered himself into the nearest chair. We mistook natural atmospheric rhythms for constant instability. Ryan could almost hear decades of scientific assumptions collapsing inside the doctor's mind. Nobody had falsified data. Nobody had lied. They had simply viewed an unfamiliar planet through familiar biology. Commander the Rex folded his hands behind his back. Human Mercer, how dangerous would this environment appear to someone raised on Earth? Ryan studied the latest atmospheric reading before answering honestly. I would not call it safe. The commander nodded. But, Ryan smiled slightly, I would call it manageable with common sense. Several technicians looked genuinely shocked by that answer. One of them asked, you mean humans would willingly build a research station here? Ryan chuckled. Give us enough coffee, decent air conditioning, and reliable internet. And somebody would probably complain about the commute before complaining about the planet. For the first time since landing, a few nervous laughs spread through the shuttle. Even Selvek managed a faint smile before catching himself. The tension eased just enough for everyone to breathe a little easier. Then the external monitoring system chimed. The forward cameras had detected movement nearly 200 yards from the landing site. Nothing aggressive. just several distant shapes moving slowly across the rocky plain. Every alien aboard instinctively stiffened. Ryan narrowed his eyes at the screen. The figures were large, steady, and completely uninterested in the shuttle. They looked less like predators and more like animals following an ancient migration route. Commander the Rex quietly muted the room. Nobody spoke as they watched the creatures disappear behind a line of weathered stone. Ryan kept staring at the empty horizon afterward, realizing something that made the silence feel different. Whatever lived on this world had already noticed the newcomers, and for reasons nobody aboard could explain, it had chosen to simply keep walking. The figures did not return for almost 20 minutes, but nobody inside the shuttle stopped watching the monitors. Every sensor remained locked on the same stretch of open ground where the strange animals had disappeared beyond the rocky ridge. Dr. Selvek finally broke the silence. Their movement pattern is unusual. They ignored the strongest artificial energy source within 50 miles. Ryan kept studying the playback. Maybe they did not think we were worth investigating. One technician shook her head. That has never happened on an unexplored world. Ryan smiled. There is a first time for everything. Commander the Rex slowly turned toward the crew. We need better data, but our drones are still producing contradictory readings. Ryan looked at the equipment bay where 2 disabled survey units sat connected to diagnostic cables. What if the drones are the problem? Selvek raised an eyebrow. Explain. Ryan walked over to one of the damaged machines and crouched beside it. Every sensor on these things is constantly transmitting signals. Heat scans, atmospheric analysis, active mapping. If the local wildlife evolved around natural conditions, these machines probably sound like marching bands. The younger technician blinked. You think we are announcing our presence? Back home, Ryan replied. Hunters usually see more wildlife after they stop making noise. The room fell quiet again. Nobody had considered that possibility. Coalition expeditions relied on increasingly sophisticated technology because technology had always produced better results. On Earth, Ryan had learned something different. Sometimes the smartest thing a person could do was slow down and simply observe. Commander the Rex nodded once. Deactivate every non-essential external transmitter. One by one, the shuttle powered down active scanners. The constant electronic hum faded until only passive cameras remained online. The valley outside seemed strangely peaceful without layers of digital overlays covering every inch of the landscape. Nearly 10 minutes passed. Then the movement returned. This time the creatures emerged from behind the ridge much closer than before. There were 6 of them, each standing roughly 7 feet tall on 4 powerful legs with broad shoulders and long necks that swayed gently as they walked. Their skin reflected shades of gray and bronze beneath the afternoon sunlight, blending almost perfectly with the surrounding rock. They never hurried. They simply crossed the valley together with calm confidence. Ryan found himself smiling without realizing it. They remind me of elk. Selvek looked confused. What is an elk? Ryan chuckled softly. Big animals where I come from. They usually mind their own business unless somebody gives them a reason not to. One of the creatures paused and slowly lifted its head toward the shuttle. Every alien aboard held their breath. The animal remained perfectly still for several seconds before lowering its head again and continuing after the rest of the herd. No charge. No warning display. No sign of fear. It was as though the shuttle had become just another rock sitting in the valley. Extraordinary, Selvek whispered. Ryan nodded. Looks pretty normal to me. The doctor looked at him in disbelief. Normal? Ryan shrugged. Wild animals usually do not waste energy looking for trouble. They avoid it when they can. Commander the Rex replayed the footage again and again. The creatures had approached only after the expedition stopped flooding the valley with electronic signals. They had not feared the visitors, nor had they welcomed them. They had simply accepted their presence without concern. Ryan rested his hand against the cool observation window and watched the last animal disappear into the distance. Whatever life had evolved on Vesper 9 did not seem interested in proving how dangerous it was. For the first time since arriving, Ryan wondered if the greatest mystery on this planet was not how anything survived here. It was why the galaxy had spent centuries assuming everything here wanted them dead. Commander the Rex made his decision before anyone else could object. Passive observation has changed what we know about this planet. We proceed one step further, but under controlled conditions. Every eye in the shuttle shifted toward Ryan. He already knew what the commander was about to ask. You want me to go outside? The Rex nodded once. Only if you agree. Ryan did not answer immediately. The confidence he had shown until now had never come from believing he was invincible. His palms felt damp. His heartbeat had been climbing ever since the conversation started. He quietly admitted something to himself that he had not wanted anyone else to see. He was scared. Anyone with common sense would be. He had spent his career fixing industrial systems, not volunteering to become the first person to stand on a planet the galaxy considered uninhabitable. He closed his eyes for a brief second and pictured his father tightening the straps on an old hiking backpack before their first mountain trip together. His father had always repeated the same sentence whenever Ryan hesitated at the start of a difficult trail. Respect nature. Do not fear it so much that you stop paying attention. Ryan opened his eyes and looked back toward the hatch. I will go, he said quietly. Dr. Selvek immediately stepped forward. Then you will wear full environmental protection. Ryan nodded. That seems fair. The next 30 minutes disappeared into careful preparation. Every seal on the protective suit was inspected 3 separate times. Backup oxygen cylinders were tested. Medical monitors were attached across Ryan's chest and wrists. Selvek personally verified every reading before finally stepping back. If anything changes, he said, you return immediately. Ryan smiled. That was already the plan. The heavy outer hatch slowly began cycling open. A cool breeze slipped through the widening gap before the pressure systems fully equalized. Ryan noticed the smell first. Dry stone, damp soil somewhere in the distance. A faint mineral scent that reminded him of hiking trails after a summer rainstorm. Nothing about it matched the terrifying descriptions he had listened to for days. Environmental readings remain unchanged, one technician reported nervously. Still classified as biologically incompatible. Ryan stepped onto the landing ramp. Every movement felt strangely slow. Beneath his boots, the metal vibrated softly against the shuttle frame while the open valley stretched quietly ahead. The distant herd had vanished beyond the hills. Wind rolled through scattered rock formations with a low whistle that sounded almost peaceful. How are you feeling? Selvek asked through the communication link. Ryan looked around before answering. Like I should have packed better hiking boots. Nobody replied for several seconds. Then a surprised laugh escaped one of the younger technicians before she quickly covered her mouth. Even Commander the Rex allowed himself the smallest smile. Ryan reached the bottom of the ramp and stopped. The dusty ground beneath his boots looked no different from countless trails he had walked back on Earth. He crouched slowly and picked up a small reddish stone. It felt warm from the afternoon sun. Perfectly ordinary. He turned it over once before placing it back exactly where he had found it. Anything unusual? Selvek asked. Ryan looked across the silent valley one more time. Only one thing, he answered. This place does not feel like it has been waiting to kill us. As those words left his mouth, movement appeared again on a distant ridge. One of the massive native animals stepped into view, watched Ryan for several quiet seconds, and then calmly lowered its head before continuing along its path, as though greeting another creature that simply belonged there. Ryan remained outside for another 15 minutes while the shuttle recorded every heartbeat, every breath, and every environmental change. Nothing happened. His oxygen level stayed normal. His pulse gradually slowed as the initial tension faded. Dr. Selvek stared at the medical display as though it belonged to someone else. Blood oxygen is stable, he whispered. Respiratory function remains completely normal. There is no evidence of tissue stress. Commander the Rex folded his arms. Run the analysis again. I already have. Then run it a third time. Ryan heard the conversation through his communications link and smiled to himself. You know, he said, looking across the valley. My mother would probably tell me to put on a jacket before worrying about anything else. Selvek sounded genuinely confused. Your concern in this moment is temperature? That is usually how parents work. Another long silence followed. Ryan slowly walked several yards away from the shuttle, careful not to disturb the landscape. He noticed patches of pale green vegetation growing between the rocks. Small insects drifted lazily above them on transparent wings that shimmered in the afternoon light. Life was everywhere once he stopped looking for monsters. The frightening image described in centuries of expedition reports simply did not match what stood in front of him. Back inside the shuttle, the science team had already shifted from fear to disbelief. Every new reading challenged assumptions that had survived for generations. One technician suddenly looked up from her console. "Doctor," I expanded the biological comparison. Selvek hurried across the cabin. "What did you find?" The atmospheric compounds classified as universally toxic are only universally toxic for coalition physiology. Human respiratory chemistry neutralizes several of them naturally before they become harmful. The doctor stared at the equations scrolling across the display. "That cannot be correct." I checked twice. Ryan listened quietly while kneeling beside one of the strange plants. Its leaves felt thick and slightly waxy, almost like certain desert plants back on Earth. He did not touch it. He simply admired how ordinary it seemed. "Ryan," Selvek finally said over the radio, his voice noticeably softer than before. "Please answer one question honestly." "Sure. Did your government know this would happen before sending you?" Ryan laughed. "No chance. They probably expected me to fix broken equipment, file expense reports, and complain about cafeteria food. That is usually my job." Even Commander the Rex smiled at that answer. The tension that had defined the expedition since landing was quietly disappearing. In its place came something far more powerful: humility. The galaxy had not discovered an indestructible human. They had discovered that their definition of a deadly world had never included a species shaped by Earth. The realization spread through the shuttle faster than any alarm ever had. Ryan looked toward the distant ridge again. The large native animals had returned, grazing peacefully beneath the pale blue sky without paying him much attention. One younger creature lifted its head briefly, studied him from a distance, then calmly returned to feeding beside the others. Ryan shook his head with a quiet grin. "Doctor." "Yes. I think they have already decided I am boring." Selvek looked at the live video feed for several thoughtful seconds before answering. "Or perhaps," he said slowly, "they simply recognize that you belong in an environment we never understood." No one aboard the shuttle argued with him. For the first time since the mission began, every scientist in the cabin found themselves considering a possibility that had never appeared in any textbook. Perhaps the greatest mistake the Coalition had ever made was believing that every intelligent species had to be measured against themselves. 3 months later, the official designation of Vesper 9 quietly disappeared from every Coalition database. The words atmospheric death zone were replaced with something far less dramatic: ongoing multi-species research site. Scientists across the galaxy argued for weeks about the decision, but none of them could argue with the evidence. Hundreds of hours of recordings showed the same impossible result. Ryan Mercer had walked across the surface, worked outdoors for hours at a time, and returned perfectly healthy every single day. New research teams eventually arrived, bringing engineers, biologists, geologists, and environmental specialists from dozens of worlds. Most still wore fully sealed protective suits. Ryan usually greeted them wearing a light field jacket, a baseball cap, and the same easy smile that had confused everyone since the day the shuttle landed. Dr. Selvek had changed more than anyone noticed. During the first briefing for the new arrivals, one nervous scientist asked him the same question he had once asked Ryan: "Is this world truly safe?" Selvek looked through the observation window before answering. "That depends on who you are. Safety is not only about the world around you. Sometimes it is about understanding yourself first." Ryan happened to overhear the conversation while carrying a crate of replacement sensors toward the communications tower. He smiled without interrupting. The doctor had learned something much larger than atmospheric chemistry. One afternoon, Commander the Rex joined Ryan outside as the familiar herd crossed the valley once again. They watched the animals disappear over the distant ridge exactly as they had done countless times before. "Do you know what surprises me the most?" the Rex asked. Ryan shook his head. "Not once did this planet try to prove how dangerous it was. We imagined that part ourselves." Ryan picked up a small stone and rolled it gently between his fingers before placing it back where it belonged. "People do that too," he said. "We decide somebody is impossible to understand before we ever give them a chance." The commander considered those words for a long time. Perhaps that is why so many first contacts fail. Months later, the Coalition published the largest revision to its biological classification system in recorded history. The report did not celebrate human superiority. Instead, it admitted a simpler truth: no civilization should ever assume its own experience defines the limits of every other species. Earth was no longer described as an unusually resilient world. It became the reference point for understanding adaptation itself. On Ryan's final evening before returning home, he stood alone outside the research station, watching the sunset spread warm shades of gold and crimson across the quiet valley. The wind carried the same dry scent it had on the first day. Behind him, new scientists hurried between laboratories, excited to study a world they had feared for centuries. Ahead of him, the native animals continued their slow journey across the hills without paying any attention to history being rewritten. Ryan drew one slow, comfortable breath and smiled. Funny, he whispered to himself. Nothing out here ever changed. He looked back once at the station lights glowing against the gathering dusk and realized the planet had never been the mystery. The real mystery had always been how easily intelligent people mistake unfamiliar for impossible. Sometimes the greatest discoveries are not hidden behind stronger walls or better technology. Sometimes they begin the moment someone is willing to question a fear that everyone else accepted as fact. And every now and then, all it takes to change an entire galaxy is one ordinary person who quietly decides to take the next breath.